The day her son got married, Eleanor Carter learned that silence could carry more power than words ever spoken. At the small countryside chapel outside Austin, Texas, she stood at the edge of the gathering as Michael Carter exchanged vows with Savannah Reed, a woman who smiled too easily and observed everything with quiet calculation. Eleanor's hands remained folded, her expression calm, almost unreadable, as if she were simply another guest instead of the mother who had raised the groom alone after years of sacrifice. No one noticed the way Savannah's eyes briefly assessed her, measuring her like an object that no longer held relevance. No one noticed how Michael avoided meeting his mother's gaze for too long, as though something unspoken weighed between them. The celebration continued with polite laughter and clinking glasses, but Eleanor's attention drifted inward, to something no one in that room could see or understand. Only weeks earlier, she had stood in a quiet office listening to a lawyer confirm what Robert Carter had left behind: full ownership of a vast ranch outside San Antonio, acres of land that stretched farther than most people could imagine. It had been a life built with her late husband, place of work, memory, and endurance. Yet Eleanor had said nothing about it to Michael. She had chosen silence instead of revelation. As she watched Savannah take her place beside her son, Eleanor understood that timing was everything. Words spoken too soon could destroy peace, but words withheld could build something far stronger. After Robert's passing, the house had felt emptier, not just of sound but of purpose, and Michael's growing distance had made Eleanor realize that love inside families could shift quietly, almost invisibly, until it no longer felt like love at all. Savannah had begun suggesting changes even before the wedding, small comments disguised as practical advice, about space, about future plans, about what was or was not necessary anymore. Eleanor never argued. She simply listened. At the reception hall, beneath soft golden lighting, guests toasted the new couple while Eleanor remained composed, observing rather than participating. Inside her mind, she was no longer just a mother attending her son's wedding. She was a woman carrying knowledge no one else had yet discovered. The ranch remained legally hers, a truth she had decided to keep hidden until the moment revealed its own necessity. She had learned from grief that urgency clouded judgment, but patience clarified everything. As Savannah leaned into Michael's side, smiling for photographs, Eleanor felt no resentment, only a quiet awareness that the balance of this family had already begun to shift, though none of them could see it yet. She adjusted her coat slightly and looked toward the distant hills beyond the chapel, where the land stretched wide and quiet, knowing that what was signed on paper could reshape everything when the time came to reveal it, and that no one at this wedding had yet understood how much had already changed beneath the surface. Time moved forward quietly in the weeks after the wedding, and Eleanor Carter returned to her daily life on the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, where the land stretched wide under an open sky and the silence felt less like emptiness and more like something alive. Each morning began the same way, with soft light spilling across the wooden floors of the house she had shared with Robert Carter, now gone, leaving behind only memories and paperwork that most people would never see. Michael Carter called less often than before. His voice always rushed, as if every conversation had to compete with something more important. When he did call, he spoke about his new life with Savannah Reed in careful, measured sentences, mentioning plans, finances, and future arrangements in ways that made Eleanor feel increasingly like someone standing at the edge of her own family. Savannah, when she briefly came on the line, was always polite, always precise, but there was something underneath her tone that Eleanor could not ignore, a subtle shift in authority, as though Savannah was slowly rewriting the rules of what this family would become. Eleanor never argued. She simply listened and said very little, choosing instead to observe. After every call, she would step outside onto the porch, where the wind moved across the ranch fields in steady waves, and she would think about the conversation she had not yet shared with anyone. The ownership of the ranch remained in her name, a fact confirmed quietly through legal documents she had reviewed alone in her study one evening. Long after the wedding had ended and the guests had gone home, Robert had ensured it would be hers, not as a gesture of control, but as a recognition of partnership built over decades of shared work and sacrifice. Yet Eleanor had not spoken of it, not to Michael, not to anyone in the family, because she understood that revealing something powerful too early often invited unnecessary conflict before clarity could form. Days passed with a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. She tended to the land, walked the fence lines, and checked the small details of maintenance that kept the ranch functioning smoothly. There was comfort in the physical work, in the certainty of tasks that did not require explanation or negotiation. But beneath that calm, Eleanor began noticing changes in the way Michael and Savannah communicated with her. Questions about the ranch became more frequent, framed as curiosity but carrying a subtle weight, as if they were trying to understand something without directly asking. Savannah once mentioned casually that large properties often became burdens for older generations, a comment delivered with a soft smile that lingered in Eleanor's mind long after the conversation ended. Michael said nothing to challenge it. Instead, he nodded, as he often did now, deferring to Savannah's perspective in a way that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Eleanor watched all of it without interruption, her expression steady, her responses minimal. She had lived long enough to recognize that change inside families rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived slowly, in small adjustments of language and attention. And as the ranch remained quiet under the wide Texas sky, Eleanor Carter continued to observe, knowing that what was unspoken often carried more meaning than what was said aloud. Michael Carter arrived at the ranch one late afternoon without much warning, his truck raising a thin trail of dust along the long gravel road that led to the main house outside San Antonio, Texas. Eleanor Carter saw him first from the porch, standing still as the engine turned off and the door opened. He looked older in a way she had not fully noticed before, not in appearance alone but in the way he carried himself, as if every step required quiet negotiation with invisible pressures. Savannah Reed stepped out beside him, composed and precise, her presence immediately changing the atmosphere in a way Eleanor had begun to recognize. They greeted her politely, but there was an underlying tension that no one acknowledged directly. Inside the house, conversation began with careful words about family life, work, and the future. Michael spoke about how fast things were moving, how responsibilities were increasing, and how important it was to make practical decisions early. Savannah added comments about efficiency and planning, always framed gently, always appearing reasonable. Eleanor listened without interruption, offering tea and small acknowledgments, her expression calm and unreadable. As they sat in the living room, Savannah eventually allowed her gaze to drift around the space, observing the wooden beams, the open layout, and the sense of permanence the ranch carried. She mentioned how maintaining such a large property might become complicated over time, especially for someone living alone. Her tone was careful, almost considerate, but the implication beneath her words was clear enough that silence followed immediately after. Michael did not challenge her statement. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if weighing something internally, and that moment told Eleanor more than any direct conversation could have. She had seen this pattern before. Small agreements forming without discussion, decisions being shaped indirectly until they felt inevitable. Later, while walking with Michael near the edge of the property, where the grass met the distant line of oak trees, Eleanor noticed how he avoided looking directly at her when speaking about long-term plans. He talked about stability, about ensuring that everything was organized properly for the future, using language that sounded responsible but felt increasingly detached from personal connection. When Eleanor asked a simple question about what he meant by those plans, he hesitated for only a second before answering vaguely, changing the subject shortly afterward. That hesitation lingered in her mind long after the conversation ended. As evening approached and Savannah prepared to leave, she thanked Eleanor politely for the visit, her tone warm but controlled. Before stepping into the vehicle, she paused briefly and looked back at the house, as if evaluating it one final time. Eleanor remained on the porch, watching without expression as the truck disappeared down the long road. The quiet that returned afterward was not the same quiet she had known before. Felt more structured, more intentional, as if something had shifted beneath the surface of daily life. Standing there in the fading light, Eleanor understood that the questions forming around her life were no longer distant or theoretical, and that the balance she had quietly maintained was beginning to move in ways that would eventually require a decision she had not yet spoken aloud. The following weeks revealed patterns Eleanor Carter could no longer ignore, as life on the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, continued under a quiet tension that never fully settled. Michael Carter began visiting more frequently, but each visit felt increasingly structured, almost as if it were arranged rather than spontaneous. Savannah Reed often accompanied him, and their conversations followed a familiar rhythm that Eleanor had come to recognize. Practical discussions framed as concern, suggestions delivered as reason, and conclusions that seemed to form themselves without direct agreement. One afternoon, while they sat at the kitchen table, Savannah casually mentioned that many families eventually transitioned large properties into more manageable arrangements, especially when only one person remained responsible for upkeep. Her tone was gentle, but her words carried a direction that pointed toward a future decision already forming in her mind. Michael did not interrupt. Instead, he focused on his coffee, nodding occasionally, as if absorbing ideas rather than responding to them. Eleanor observed everything with steady calm, offering no resistance. No correction. Only quiet acknowledgement. Later that evening, after they left, she walked alone along the edge of the property where the grass met the open fields. The wind moved softly through the tall grass, and the sound of distant cattle carried across the land. She thought about how conversations had changed, how questions had become suggestions, and how suggestions had slowly turned into expectations. What struck her most was not what was being said, but what was no longer being asked. Michael no longer sought her opinion with the same openness he once had. Instead, he seemed to arrive with answers already forming, shaped by conversations Eleanor had not been part of. That realization stayed with her as she returned to the house, where framed photographs of past years lined the hallway, each one capturing moments that now felt distant in a different way. The ranch, once a place of shared memory, now felt like a place being quietly redefined in conversation. One evening, Savannah arrived alone briefly before Michael, bringing documents she referred to as preliminary planning notes. She placed them on the table with careful precision, explaining that they were simply ideas to help organize future responsibilities. The language was neutral, professional, almost polite, yet the structure of what she presented suggested a direction that extended far beyond casual discussion. Eleanor listened without reacting, her hands resting calmly in her lap. When Savannah finished speaking, she smiled as though expecting agreement or at least acknowledgement. Eleanor simply thanked her for the information and said she would review it later. After Savannah left, Eleanor remained seated at the table for a long time, looking at the papers without opening them. She understood then that the conversation around her life had already moved into a new stage, one where assumptions were beginning to replace questions. The ranch outside San Antonio remained unchanged in appearance, but within the family dynamic, something had shifted irreversibly into motion, and Eleanor Carter now recognized that silence would no longer be enough to keep the balance steady. By the time autumn light settled over the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, Eleanor Carter had begun to notice something different in the rhythm of her daily life. Not in the land itself but in the way people moved through it when they visited. Michael Carter arrived one morning earlier than usual, alone this time, without Savannah Reed, and that alone already felt unusual enough to draw Eleanor's quiet attention. He walked through the front gate with a distracted expression, holding his phone more often than making eye contact, as if he were balancing two conversations at once, one in front of him and one somewhere else entirely. When he entered the house, he did not sit immediately as he once used to, but instead looked around briefly, as though assessing something he had not fully considered before. Eleanor offered him coffee, and he accepted with a small nod, but the ease that once existed between them felt noticeably reduced. As they sat at the kitchen table, Michael spoke about financial organization again, this time more directly than before, mentioning documentation, responsibilities, and long-term planning in a way that no longer sounded like casual discussion. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed, as if he had repeated the same thoughts elsewhere before bringing them here. Eleanor listened without interruption, her hands resting calmly on the table, her expression steady, offering no resistance and no approval. When he finished speaking, there was a silence that stretched longer than usual, not uncomfortable in an obvious way, but heavy with meaning that neither of them addressed. Later that afternoon, Savannah arrived unexpectedly, her presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the house as it always did. She greeted Eleanor politely, then joined Michael at the table where the earlier conversation had taken place. This time, she brought printed documents again, organized neatly, referring to them as updated planning suggestions for the future of the ranch. Her language remained careful, but the structure of her ideas was becoming more specific, more directed, as if each conversation was narrowing toward a single intended outcome. She spoke about efficiency, about simplifying responsibilities, and about ensuring that decisions were made before situations became complicated. Michael nodded occasionally, but Eleanor noticed something new in him as well, a subtle hesitation that had not been present before, as if he was beginning to see the conversation from more than one angle. When Savannah paused, she looked toward Eleanor, waiting for a response. Eleanor met her gaze calmly, and said only that she would consider everything carefully, her voice even and measured. After a brief silence, Savannah smiled again and closed the folder, as if accepting that the conversation would continue later. Once they left together, the house returned to its usual quiet, but Eleanor remained seated for a long time, not moving, not speaking, simply observing the space around her. The same kitchen, the same table, the same walls that had held decades of family history, now felt like they were standing at the edge of something shifting beneath the surface. She finally rose and walked toward the window, looking out across the wide Texas land that belonged legally to her, though few in the family had ever spoken that truth aloud in recent times. What troubled her was not the presence of questions anymore, but the direction those questions were quietly taking, forming pathways that were no longer uncertain but increasingly defined. And Eleanor Carter understood with growing clarity that what had once been quiet observation was now becoming a situation that would soon require her to speak more directly than she had chosen to so far. The shift in Eleanor Carter's reality became more apparent in the following days on the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, where conversations that once felt familiar now carried an undercurrent of calculation that she could no longer ignore. Michael Carter arrived again, this time with Savannah Reed, and their presence together created a dynamic that felt increasingly structured, as though every visit was part of a larger conversation that had been continuing without her full participation. They sat in the living room, speaking in measured tones about organization, efficiency, and long-term planning, But Eleanor noticed that the language had evolved. It was no longer suggestions or casual ideas. It was becoming language of direction, language of decision. Savannah spoke with calm certainty about simplifying responsibilities, about ensuring that the ranch would not become an unnecessary burden, and about making arrangements before complications could arise. Michael listened more than he spoke, occasionally agreeing with small nods. But there was a hesitation now that had not been there before, as if part of him was beginning to recognize the weight behind what was being proposed. Eleanor remained composed throughout, her posture steady, her responses minimal. She did not interrupt, nor did she challenge the ideas being presented. Instead, she observed the subtle shifts in how authority was being expressed within her own home, and how easily it was being assumed without formal agreement. After a long discussion, Savannah gently placed another set of documents on the table, describing them as revised plans intended to help structure future decisions more clearly. The tone was polite, but the intention behind it was unmistakably forward-moving, as if the ranch had already begun transitioning in conversation before any formal acknowledgement. Michael looked at the papers longer this time before responding, his silence carrying more weight than his words. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, less certain, and for the first time Eleanor sensed that something within him was no longer entirely aligned with the direction being taken. Savannah noticed the hesitation as well, but she did not press immediately. Instead, she simply closed the folder and smiled lightly, as though patience was part of a longer strategy. After they left, the house fell into its usual quiet, but Eleanor did not return to her routine immediately. She stayed seated at the table, looking at the empty space where the documents had been placed, reflecting on how easily discussions could shape perception when repeated often enough. She thought about Robert Carter and the way he had built this ranch not just with land and structures, but with intention and foresight, ensuring that what mattered most was never dependent on shifting opinions. Later that evening, she walked alone outside, the wind moving gently across the fields, carrying the sound of distant cattle and rustling grass. The land stretched wide and uninterrupted, unchanged in appearance, yet she understood now that what was happening within her family was no longer about simple conversations or preferences. It was about direction, influence, and control over what would come next. And for the first time since these visits had begun, Eleanor Carter recognized that remaining silent carried consequences that were becoming harder to ignore. The tension that had been building slowly across the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, reached a more defined shape in the days that followed, as Michael Carter returned again, this time with an expression that carried less certainty than before. He arrived alone first, standing on the porch for a moment before entering, as if measuring the air itself before stepping inside. Eleanor Carter noticed the change immediately. His movements were less confident, his pauses longer, and his attention divided in a way that suggested internal conflict. When Savannah Reed arrived shortly after, the atmosphere shifted again into its familiar structure, but even she seemed to sense that something had subtly changed. Inside the house, they sat together in the living room, continuing discussions that had become routine. Savannah spoke with her usual calm precision about organization, future planning, and the importance of making decisions that would prevent uncertainty later. Her tone remained polite, but there was an increasing firmness behind her words, as if the direction she was describing had already been decided elsewhere. Michael listened, but this time he did not immediately agree. Instead, he leaned back slightly, looking toward the floor for a longer moment than usual before responding. When he spoke, his voice carried hesitation, as if he was carefully choosing each word rather than following a prepared line of thought. Eleanor observed this shift quietly, her hands folded, her expression unchanged, but her awareness sharpened. The conversation moved forward. Yet something inside it no longer aligned as smoothly as before. Savannah mentioned again the idea of restructuring responsibilities connected to the ranch, explaining it as a practical step that would benefit everyone involved. She spoke about clarity, efficiency, and reducing complexity, but the underlying direction remained consistent with previous visits. This time, however, Michael did not immediately support the idea. He asked a simple question about timing, about whether such decisions required more discussion with all involved parties. The question itself was mild, but its presence changed the rhythm in the room. Savannah paused briefly before responding, maintaining her calm tone, but her smile tightened slightly as she explained that these were still early planning stages. Eleanor listened without interruption, but internally she noted the subtle shift in alignment. What had once felt like a coordinated direction was now showing small fractures, not large enough to be visible to everyone, but clear enough to someone who had been observing closely for some time. After a while, the conversation softened into general remarks about daily life, but the earlier tension remained beneath it. When Savannah finally stood to leave, she expressed polite appreciation for the time and the discussion, but her eyes lingered a moment longer on Michael before she stepped outside. Michael followed shortly after, but instead of leaving immediately with her, he remained on the porch with Eleanor for a brief moment. The silence between them was different now, less structured, more uncertain. He looked toward the open land beyond the house, then back at his mother, as if considering something he had not yet fully formed into words. He did not speak much before leaving, but his hesitation remained in the air long after his truck disappeared down the gravel road. Eleanor stood at the doorway watching until the dust settled completely, her expression steady but thoughtful. The ranch stretched outward in every direction, unchanged in appearance, yet the human dynamics surrounding it had begun to shift in ways that were no longer subtle enough to ignore. And Eleanor Carter understood that what was unfolding within her family was no longer just conversation, but a quiet divergence that would eventually require a clear and irreversible choice. The distance between intention and action became increasingly visible on the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, as Eleanor Carter observed the subtle shifts unfolding within her family with a clarity she could no longer ignore. Michael Carter had not visited in several days, and when he finally arrived, his presence carried a quieter, more reflective energy than before. He did not bring Savannah Reed with him, which immediately changed the atmosphere in a way Eleanor recognized as significant. When he entered the house, he paused longer than usual in the doorway, looking around as if seeing the space differently for the first time. Eleanor greeted him calmly, offering tea as she always did, and he accepted, though his movements lacked the usual rhythm of routine. They sat together at the kitchen table, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The silence was not heavy, but it was deliberate, as if both were waiting for something unspoken to surface first. Finally, Michael began speaking, but his tone was no longer aligned with the structured discussions that had defined previous visits. He mentioned Savannah, but not with agreement or alignment, rather with questions that suggested uncertainty. He spoke about timing, about decisions that felt increasingly complicated, and about whether certain assumptions had been made too quickly. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression steady, her presence unchanged, but she noted every shift in his phrasing. Where there had once been confidence shaped by external direction, there was now hesitation, and beneath that hesitation, something closer to doubt. As the conversation continued, Michael admitted that he had begun reviewing information more carefully, asking questions he had previously accepted without hesitation. He did not accuse anyone directly, but his language reflected a growing awareness that the narrative surrounding the ranch and its future was not as simple as it had been presented. Eleanor responded with quiet restraint, offering no opinion that would guide his thinking in any direction. She understood that clarity could not be imposed. It had to emerge on its own. After a long pause, Michael asked her directly about the ranch, not in terms of plans or restructuring, but in terms of ownership and intention. The question was simple, but it carried weight that had been building for some time. Eleanor looked at him for a moment before answering, her voice calm and measured as she confirmed that the ranch had been placed under her full ownership by Robert Carter years earlier, a fact she had not felt the need to introduce into conversations that had not required it. Michael did not respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, processing the information in silence. The realization seemed to settle over him slowly, not as shock, but as recalibration. He had assumed certain things based on partial conversations, but those assumptions now stood on uncertain ground. When Savannah's name came up briefly in his questions, it was no longer with alignment, but with inquiry. Eleanor did not elaborate beyond what was necessary, maintaining her consistent restraint. As the afternoon light shifted across the kitchen, Michael remained seated longer than usual, his thoughts no longer externalized through structured plans or borrowed certainty. He eventually stood, thanking her quietly before stepping outside. From the porch, he looked across the vast Texas land that stretched beyond the house, the same land that had been spoken about so often in abstract terms but understood so differently now. Eleanor remained inside, watching through the window as he stood still for a moment longer than necessary, and in that silence she recognized that something fundamental had changed, not through confrontation, but through understanding, and that the direction of the family had begun to shift in a way that could no longer be reversed by assumption alone. The final shift in the Carter family dynamic on the ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, did not arrive with confrontation or argument, but with a quiet clarity that unfolded over time as Michael Carter returned one afternoon alone, without Savannah Reed, and stepped into the house with a different kind of presence. Eleanor Carter noticed it immediately, not because he spoke differently at first, but because he did not speak quickly at all. He sat at the kitchen table without urgency, his hands resting still, his eyes no longer searching for confirmation in the way they once did. The silence between them felt different now, not tense, but settled, as if something unresolved had finally been acknowledged internally. After a long moment, Michael began speaking, not about plans or organization or external advice, but about what he had begun to understand. He admitted that assumptions he had accepted were not as clear as they once seemed, and that certain conversations had shaped his perspective without him fully recognizing the direction they were leading. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, offering no correction and no reinforcement, allowing him to arrive at his own clarity without interference. When Savannah's influence entered the conversation, it was not through accusation, but through recognition. Michael spoke carefully, as if testing the weight of his own thoughts, acknowledging that he had begun to question the framing of decisions that had once seemed straightforward. Eleanor did not respond with emotion or emphasis. She simply confirmed what was necessary, stating once again, with quiet precision, that the ranch had been legally placed under her ownership by Robert Carter long before recent discussions had begun, and that it had never been transferred or shared in any capacity that altered that fact. The words were not delivered as a revelation, but as a clarification of something already established. Michael remained silent for a long time after hearing this, not out of disbelief, but out of recalibration, as if pieces of a structure he had assumed were stable were now being reassembled in his mind. He looked out through the window toward the open land, the same fields that had been spoken about in terms of planning and future decisions, but which now existed outside those conversations entirely. When he finally spoke again, his tone was quieter, stripped of earlier certainty, and he acknowledged that he had been moving through interpretations that were not fully his own. There was no confrontation, no defense, only a growing awareness that clarity had been delayed by assumptions he had not questioned soon enough. Eleanor remained composed throughout, her presence unchanged, not asserting authority, but embodying it through consistency and restraint. As the afternoon light shifted across the kitchen and moved slowly toward evening, Michael stood and prepared to leave. Before stepping out, he paused briefly, looking back at his mother not with distance, but with recognition that something fundamental had settled into place between them. Outside, the ranch stretched endlessly under the Texas sky, unchanged in structure but different in meaning for both of them. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he walked toward his truck, and in that final moment of silence, she understood that the balance within her family had not been taken or forced, but revealed through time, patience, and the quiet certainty that truth, when held long enough, eventually defines its own space.